Hello and welcome to TRIGGERnometry. I'm Francis Foster.
I'm Konstantin Kisin.
And this is the show for you if you're bored of people arguing on the internet over subjects they know nothing about. At TRIGGERnometry, we don't pretend to be the experts, we ask the experts.
Our fantastic expert guest this week is a journalist, think tanker, and the author of The Road to Somewhere, David Goodhart. Welcome to TRIGGERnometry.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. The question we always like to ask at the beginning is, how are you where you are? What's been your journey through life? Have there been any kind of things in your life that have informed the work that you do and the views that you now hold?
Yes, I mean, my entire life, I guess, has helped to inform the views I have. I came from a very, very privileged background. My father was a Conservative MP. I went to a very grand public school. Combination of those two things meant, growing up in the kind of 70s, that inevitably I became a leftist. And at university was really pretty radical. So I think I kind of understand some of the kind of mentality of the attractions, indeed, of the kind of holistic worldview of kind of Islamism or Marxism or whatever. Indeed, I found being a Marxist for a few years in my kind of late teens, early 20s was enormously intellectually productive in some ways because of the kind of intellectual vanity of Marxism. You have to be an expert or pretend to be an expert on everything. You have to kind of have a theory on everything. So it's quite good training for kind of journalism and think tank world. But I kind of gradually read my way out of the more kind of silly and extreme views that I had at that time. But I consider myself to be very much on the centre-left for, I guess, most of my adult life. After university, I became a local newspaper journalist, where I'd been at university in York, and then rather accidentally ended up on the Financial Times in the early 1980s, which was wonderful training. The FT then was one of the last big institutions to believe in the generalist principle. You did a subject for 2 or 3 years, and then you moved on to a completely different subject, a bit like the higher reaches of the civil service. And I covered I was a Labour reporter covering the last great disputes against the Thatcher government in the early mid-80s, then moved on to writing about big company takeovers, and I then had the very good fortune of going to Germany just before unification, and that was a fantastic experience, and it was that I didn't, that kind of in a way sort of turned my head. I didn't really, having covered a world historic event, I didn't fancy going back to the FT and spending the next 10 or 15 years becoming features editor or whatever I might have been. So I decided to set up a magazine. I set up a magazine called Prospect, monthly current affairs magazine, really based on sort of modelled on the American magazines like the Atlantic Monthly and New York Review of Books and the New Yorker and Harper's. Obviously, we weren't going to be exactly like them. We were going to be a much smaller fry thing, but it was the lack of a proper essay writing culture here in our journalism that I hope to do something about. And I did that for 15 years, from 95 to 2015. And intellectually in that time, Prospect had started off very much as it started off in the mid-90s, was seen very much as a part of the kind of new Labour-ish world of, we were just coming to that end of that long period of Conservative rule, and we were not political with a capital P, but we were kind of happy enough to sort of go along with that sort of reformist zeitgeist. But we then, or I anyway, developed a kind of critique of aspects of contemporary liberalism, particularly on issues of race and multiculturalism and immigration. And I wrote a long essay in 2004, it was February 2004, I think, called Too Diverse, really aimed very much at the centre-left, which I still considered then my political home, essentially saying, look, there is a kind of, it was quite an abstract philosophical argument, saying about the tension between the left's two favourite principles, in a way, the principle of solidarity and the principle of diversity, and based on the common sense idea that people are ready to share with and to trust people who they're familiar with and that they know and they have some reciprocal experiences with. Based on that common sense assumption, I argued that it was an increasingly diverse society, not just through immigration, but through kind of also, the much greater moral diversity, value diversity of modern societies. It was harder to hold on to that sense of kind of common identity across a much more varied range of people, and therefore it was much harder to persuade people to share their resources and have a degree of trust in each other, which any decent society, I think, requires. Anyway, this essay was about 6,000 words, but it was printed word for word almost in The Guardian. With our permission, obviously. I was thrilled that The Guardian wanted to reprint it, but it caused quite a kind of a little kind of hullabaloo. I was accused.
Oh, really? What a surprise! Well, this was 2004 as well.
It was 2004.
This wasn't a conversation anyone was willing to have at that time.
No, it was a little bit ahead of its time, and so I was duly described as a kind of nice racist. Even nice people do racism.
But how can you be a nice racist?
Well, I think the kind of Prospect was seen as this rather sort of genteel intellectual magazine, and Gary Young, and actually even Trevor Phillips had a go at us. Although there obviously was a bit of a cusp moment then, because it was I don't think there was any cause and effect. I wouldn't claim that, but a couple of weeks later, Trevor gave a famous interview to the Times, in which he himself was very critical of multiculturalism, thought that it is essentially kind of overstretched, and that it was now more important to worry about what we have in common rather than always stressing the importance of separate identities, which is what multiculturalism had been primarily doing.
Let me interject for our international viewers. Trevor Phillips used to be the head of the Human Rights and Equalities Commission, and he's black as well, as it happens.
Anyway, so that I sort of stumbled into this territory without really having thought very much. I kind of bought the package. I was a kind of liberal, so of course I was in favour of high levels of immigration. I'd never really sort of thought about it, but that started to sort of change my worldview to some extent, or partly the reaction to it, and I also then started to think about it these issues a lot more and read about them, and I kept getting invited to sort of seminars and conferences, and I was the BBC were quite keen on me for a while, because this really was still a time when it was quite hard to talk about sort of greater restrictions on immigration without being considered suspect on race in some way. The two things I think are now much more separated. Issues of racial justice, which are real, and the kind of economic and cultural issues associated with large-scale immigration. I think we now, partly because of the immigration from Central and Eastern Europe since 2004-05, has made it easier to separate out the two issues, which is a good thing. I do think that the debate has become more open and honest in some ways since that time. But I think it's. Becoming interested in the subject did cause me, as it were, to sort of question some of the kind of liberal assumptions that I had made earlier, and I did sort of feel myself kind of drifting away from the liberal tribe, as it were, and I think it was partly realizing both that my own instincts and the instincts of many of my fellow citizens were much more sort of communitarian, to put it no stronger, and much less sort of individualist, universalist, which is the sort of the default position of so many kind of liberal-minded graduates. Even those on the left, they tend to they tend to be very suspicious of sort of group attachments and group identities. They tend to see them as inherently kind of hostile to the other, which I don't think is either logically or historically necessary, although it clearly has sometimes been true. I mean, of course, the left tends to be hypocritical about group feelings, in that it privileges some and denigrates others, as it were. I mean, so the left is still groupist when it comes to social class, or at least the kind of, more sort of serious left, old left, if you like. But very, very suspicious of groups when it comes to ethnicity or nation even, and see certain kinds of groups as inherently sort of unreasonable in a way.
Or toxic, in fact.
Yeah, but I think it was kind of coming at the as sort of populism began to emerge as a subject. I think I had a kind of understanding, even to some extent, a kind of sympathy with some of the feelings that that people had about rapid social change, and it seemed to be completely reasonable that people were pushing back against rapid changes to neighbourhoods and ways of life, and it was this idea that is really something that has been it's really an idea that Eric Kaufmann has made his own, who I think you've interviewed him already. This idea of asymmetrical multiculturalism, the fact that multiculturalism is based around the importance of ethnicity to human beings, but only regards it somehow as being important to ethnic minorities in white European societies, and that it's almost a kind of Orientalism in relation to white people, as if white people are kind of not really, they've kind of transcended ordinary human feelings in some magical way, and don't have ethnic feelings too, like minority people do. Now, of course, it's the case that majority ethnicities are different in some ways to minority ethnicities. Yes, if it's your society, people like you, kind of generally speaking, have more power than at least relatively new arrivals, who are obviously bound to generally have less status and power in the society, at least for a generation or two. So I'm not saying that they're exactly identical, but we have clearly seen the limits of asymmetrical multiculturalism in recent years, and people have pushed back against what they see as kind of infringements on what they thought was their sort of entitlement to a relatively settled life. Now, the modern world is pretty unsettling in many ways, but politics holds out the promise. I mean, modern democratic politics, and I think we forget just how recent, really properly democratic societies we've been. I mean, how relatively recently. I mean, we had sort of formal democracy where we didn't have universal franchise till the end of the 1920s. But you had the hangovers of the attitudes of previous eras in kind of deference and respect for elites, and I think it's really only in the last sort of 20 or 30 or 40 years, you might say, that that people have come into their full democratic inheritance, and are ready to kind of use the extraordinary equality that political equality that democracy offers, in order to try and resist some of the necessary creative destruction and upheavals of modern dynamic market economies. To try and sort of almost hold the society within the bounds of that old left slogan of or sort of centre-left slogan anyway, sort of yes to a market economy but no to a market society, which I always thought was rather an attractive way of putting it in some ways. I think a lot of populism, you might say, is part of that sort of pushback against a market society, including in its sort of demographic and immigration-related aspects.
Like the idea that everything is about the economy. So that's why we tend to have this conversation about immigration strictly through the lens of the economy.
Yeah.
Right. So and I'm an immigrant myself, by the way, but it's just it blows my mind that no one seems to ever really want to talk about the cultural side of it. The fact that this constant churn and change also has an impact on people's lives, which they're frankly, this is what Eric and Matt told us about. Is 70% of Leave voters say they'd be prepared to lose out financially if it meant reducing immigration, and 35% of them say they'd be prepared to lose out significantly if it meant reducing immigration to zero.
Right. Yeah.
So people clearly don't just measure the success or failure of immigration based on the economy.
No, people don't.
And yet we always talk about it strictly in those terms, at least in the public.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think the whole point of the politics that we've been seeing in the last 5 or 10 years, the new kind of instability, I like to think of it as a kind of rebalancing, where there's been a pushback against the dominant liberalism, both economic and social and cultural liberalism of the last 30 years. Now, I mean, I think most of us, I'm certainly not against all of what liberalism has done, either economically or socially and culturally. I mean, I think that there have been great advances in many ways. We've had the great liberalisation on race, on gender, on sexuality, much of which I think has been a great human advance. I mean, we've taken seriously the kind of the idea of human moral equality, which only really became, like democracy, it's a remarkably recent idea, or at least an idea that is properly grounded in our laws and constitutions. I mean, it wasn't really until the UN Declaration of Rights in, when was it, 1948, that this idea did become commonplace, at least in Western liberal democracies, the idea of human equality, human moral equality. And of course, again, we had hangovers from earlier eras. Older generations found it kind of difficult to adjust. I mean, I think it's one of the things that lies behind 1968. I mean, particularly in Germany for obvious reasons, but in France too. The kind of the young, egalitarian-minded, mainly lefty students were saying, look, we've now got these laws that say that we're all equal, but the older generation are not behaving as if those laws were on the statute books. And they had something to beat the older generation with. They had a kind of they had a righteousness.
David, let's dig into how that happened, because you talk about this in your book, and you've come up with a way of categorizing the different groups in society who are engaged in this contest, which I think quite a lot of people are now relying on as the underpinning of their work. So tell us a little bit about the somewheres and anywheres.
Yeah, I mean, it's looking at value groups rather than social class as the new kind of motors of politics. Obviously, there's some overlap, but very broadly, what I'm talking about is the switch from a society in which politics is primarily socio-economic, in which social class are the basic units, and the issues are to do with kind of market versus state and size of the state and levels of public spending and redistribution and so on, to much more socio-cultural issues to do with identity, to do with borders, immigration, nation states, and security versus liberty issues in relation to terrorism, to gender equality issues, and how those are playing out. So these kind of socio-cultural issues have become the kind of central currency of contemporary politics, that is, and that's produced new sort of groupings, and I think value groups have become as important, if not more important, than social class groups. And yes, in my book, The Road to Somewhere, I talked about two in particular, the kind of two big ones that almost sort of, you might say, are kind of analogous with kind of middle class and working class in the older formulations. The people that see the world from anywhere and the people who see the world from somewhere. And the anywheres are about 20-25% of the population, perhaps a little bit more in different countries. I think this applies across most of the developed world, by the way, or it plays out differently in different places. So anywheres tend to be highly educated, at least an undergraduate degree, sometimes postgraduate qualifications of one kind or another. So educated and mobile, generally mobile, and particularly in this country because of residential universities, where people from whatever their social class background tend to, leave home and their hometown usually at the age of 18 and go off to 100, 150 miles away to college, and often never return to live, at least in where they came from, and you socialise with an entirely new group often, and you're cut off from the group of people that you went to school with often, and your kind of local hometown friends. This is much less true, by the way, in most other countries. It is peculiarly. I think it's one of the reasons why some of these value divides are particularly acute in this country. Half of American students live with their parents. Most middle class students, many of the elites in continental Europe, come here to university or go to America, but most ordinary middle class kids in Germany will go to the local town university. So you get more of a kind of blending. You're more likely to, even if you become a kind of upper professional, you're more likely to know somebody who's a plumber or an electrician. In this country, you have a much greater apartheid as a result of residential universities combined with London too. I think the London effect tends to.
How much do you think the class system plays into that as well? Because we are very structured by class. I mean, Oxford is and the Oxbridge are a perfect example of this.
We kind of preserved more of the external trappings of class in sort of accent, and we preserved our private schools and so on. But we're actually not that different to most other developed countries. I think we focus on the trappings as do foreigners when they kind of observe us. But all countries have their elite institutions, and most of those elite institutions are full of kids from mainly elite backgrounds. Whether the kind of énarques in France, the what are they called? All those écoles supérieures normales, all those, or the Ivy League universities in America. I mean, everybody has them, and it may be that because of private schools, ours are somewhat less meritocratic. I mean, you can kind of argue about that. But yes, I mean, there is an overlap. There's an overlap between my value groups and social class, but they are different. So you get, you get sort of social class mixes and indeed sort of ideological mixes. So you might have typical anywhere might be a very internationally minded, management consultant, speaks 3 or 4 languages, perhaps could be from a middle class background, or could be from any background really. I mean, someone who's done well, passed exams when young, went to a more or less good university, has a successful professional career, but might have very kind of free market views on economics, where somebody who is equally anywhere in their kind of socio-cultural worldview, but is an extremely left-wing sociology professor or whatever.
Yeah.
But they're both anywheres because they share those basic. They've embraced much. I mean, the left-wing sociology professor will obviously be critical of some aspect of the economic liberalism of the last 30 or 40 years, but they will both be very comfortable in the modern world. I mean, they're both. What anywheres share, despite potential disagreements over economic policy, is they believe in openness, they believe in autonomy, they tend to be highly individualistic, they tend to be comfortable with social change, they can surf, they're comfortable with social fluidity, and they have what the American sociologist Tulka Parsons called achieved identities. He talked, he's an incredibly boring sociologist, but he did come up with this very useful idea of this thinking about human identity on a spectrum between achieved and ascribed. So we all have a mix of the two, but any people from highly educated backgrounds who are kind of mobile and sort of individualistic in their life path tend to have achieved identities. Like I say, the kind of people who've passed exams and gone to good universities and have solid professional careers, they tend to think of themselves as the sort of consequence of their own achievements in some ways. And obviously that's only very partly true, but it means your identity is more kind of portable. You can take it anywhere.
It's customizable as well.
Yeah, you can fit in. You're happy living in the kind of edgy inner city in Tower Hamlets, surrounded by Bangladeshi people, British Bangladeshis or whatever. Because you have a sort of sense of yourself that's derived from your previous life achievements.
So these people make up about 20-25%.
Yeah, 20-25% of the population. Yeah, and the somewheres, just staying on the identity thing, somewheres tend to have identities that are more ascribed, i.e., things about you can't really change. I'm white, male, British, but you could, I don't know, you could be a Scottish farmer or a working class Geordie, or obviously you can change your class, but if your identity is mainly ascribed to you, then your identity is derived from the place that you come from and the groups that you belong to, some of which obviously you can't change, some of which you can, and therefore I think it's much, if you, so somewheres more, just doing my more general spiel on somewheres, unlike anywheres, tend to be much more rooted, tend to be much less well educated, tend to value the things that you would expect people from more rooted backgrounds to value: security, familiarity, and so on. But also, just looping back to the identity idea, they're having a mainly ascribed identity means that your identity is very much tied in with the places and groups that you come from. So if those places and groups change, your identity is much more susceptible to being discomforted by social change. So I think the two really important differences between the anywhere and the somewhere worldview and the anywhere and somewhere people is that, anywheres are comfortable with social change, and somewheres, obviously somewheres can be, but obviously I'm generalising, talking in averages. Most somewheres, are more likely to see change as loss, partly because they're, through being less well educated, they're less well equipped to achieve well in the modern world, so they're more likely to see. But the other big thing, so it's attitude to social change and attitude to group attachment. Anywheres, like we were talking about earlier, anywheres tend to be rather suspicious of group attachment, even rather look down upon it. Whereas to somewheres, it's an important sort of emotional sustenance to their lives, often. Not always. So I think that those are the two big differences, and it's I've invented those labels, and they rather caught on. And why the book did quite well, I think, is that they seem to be quite useful ways of looking at the modern world, thinking of the world being divided between anywheres in some ways. But it does, a lot of the critics of the book sort of said, how sort of simplistic and binary. And actually, if you read the book, you'll find it's not that binary. These are big, baggy groupings, as I said earlier, a bit like kind of working class and middle class. No one goes around sort of saying, oh, well, that's far too binary. We kind of understand that they don't necessarily say a huge amount about you, but they kind of give a kind of general fix on somebody, and they kind of, they sort of work in a rough and ready way. Obviously, there are all sorts of different kinds of anywheres. I have all sorts of subsets. There are all sorts of different kinds of somewheres. So, the kind of high end of the anywheres, there is a group about 3-5% of the population who are real kind of global villages. I mean, the kind of citizens of nowhere that Theresa May talked about. And then at the bottom end of the somewheres, you might, again on the sort of value spectrum, see people who are genuine authoritarians and xenophobes, perhaps 3-5% of the population, perhaps a bit more on some issues. And there's also a big in-betweener group, a group who share almost equally the kind of the value worldview of the anywheres and the value worldview of the somewheres. Now, like I said, I invented the labels, but I didn't. I mean, that these value groups really are there in the data, as the academics like to say.
Well, of course, otherwise the labels would be useless.
Well, but I mean, a lot of people have questioned them. But I mean, if you look at the British Social Attitude Service, I mean, it's not written down there, anywheres, but if you kind of interrogate the British social attitudes have been asking people about a whole range of things, including in this whole socio-cultural area for 35, 40 years, and so you can see the evolution of these values and ideas, and the anywhere group is growing very rapidly. I mean, this is one of the reasons for the political instability and uncertainty of more recent times is that. It's kind of the growth partly through the expansion of higher education, and higher education, particularly humanities and social sciences, are kind of engines for creating anywheres in some ways, and they have you have to go back only about 30 or 40 years, and perhaps the anywhere, the people who would have self-consciously ascribed to a kind of anywhere worldview would have been 5-10% of the population. It's now 3-4 times that, and another reason for the and that's kind of unbalanced thing. It's unbalanced society in some ways.
Well, this is what I was going to ask you. Let's get right into it, because this is all absolutely fascinating, and our viewers will be enjoying this. But if we make this theoretical conversation a little bit more practical, and we look at what's been happening in Western developed societies over the last 2 or 3 years, particularly, I mean, it's obviously part of a much longer process. But if we look at what's happening now. Is it essentially a question of the fact that the anywheres have been the ruling caste for a good period of time, and the somewheres are rebelling? Yeah,
that's essentially it. It's a rebalancing. It's a pushback against anywhere over domination, and I think anywheres, and well, we can come on to solutions later, but I think anywheres have often been oblivious of their power. They haven't realised that they are. Only a quarter or at most a third of the society, and they have assumed, I mean, often with the best of motives, they've assumed that they have been acting in the general interest when they've actually been helping to shape a society that is overwhelmingly in the interests of people like them, who have had their kind of backgrounds, who are highly educated. One can go through the list of, the knowledge economy. I mean, the very phrase suggests that this is an economy that works best for people who are highly educated. You've had rapid deindustrialization in other areas. You've had meaning. It's become harder for large sections of the population. What you've had too, something I didn't emphasise in The Road to Somewhere, but it's actually something I'm working on now for another book. The way in which cognitive ability has become the kind of gold standard of human esteem is also a very recent thing. There was a place for people who were not highly able cognitively. Cognitive ability is just one quite narrow form of human aptitude, and the way both in economics and indeed in education policy, I mean, the massive expansion of higher education in this country, at least, the continuing neglect of technical and vocational education, is another area of kind of unconscious anywhere domination. But I think underpinning all of it is the way in which we've kind of tilted the balance away from other forms of human aptitude, and people who felt that they had that they had meaningful lives. What I'm increasingly realising is that actually, looking, I mean, we'll come on to the present in a minute, but I mean, looking macro-historically, if you think of, we think of the transition from an agrarian to an industrial society as a kind of ghastly, violent, physically violent process as people poured into the kind of teeming industrial cities, and for a short period of time it was pretty dreadful, although pretty well from the beginning actually longevity and income and pretty well everything rose pretty rapidly. But what we sort of forget about the transition is actually how much continuity there was. It did not, the process of industrialization in the 19th century did not undermine traditional religious beliefs. Indeed, it created new forms of Christianity, Methodism, Wesleyism, in the big industrial cities. It did not undermine the family. Rates of illegitimacy fell pretty radically through the 19th century. No, I mean, life was, compared to today, obviously life was pretty hard for most people. But bring it forward to the 20th century and combine it with democracy and welfare states. And bear in mind also that industrial society produced new forms of meaning and identity through, particularly for men, through skilled and semi-skilled industrial employment. You compare that to the shift from an industrial to a post-industrial society, which is kind of what we're living through now. And I think you see how lots of traditional sources of meaning have been destroyed. I mean, anywhere cultural, the kind of cultural hegemony of the anywhere classes has tended to be very secular, has tended to be very liberal, has tended, as I said, to focus very much on one form of human aptitude, that of cognitive ability. And if you don't get through the bottleneck, if you're not an exam passer when you're young and you don't get into the kind of higher, into the A-level stream and then into a good university, these days not even any university, but it really has to be a good university, we've narrowed the kind of source of human esteem and meaning to that outcome. And if you think of all the kind of institutions that give you meaning and recognition unconditionally, like religion itself is fading away. The family has obviously been under great pressure in recent generations, and then other like institutions that like the big industrial factory, the military, the institutions that provided roles and meaning and usefulness to millions and millions of people who didn't necessarily thrive academically or cognitively. And so I think this is a sort of underlying explanation, I think, for a lot of the it's the kind of arrogance of the cognitive elites who have decided that their form of aptitude is the one that should hold sway, and without, I mean, they haven't intentionally downgraded other forms of aptitude, but I think whether it's sort of technical manual functions or kind of caring, the caring economy, we pay lip service to the wonderful nurses or social care workers, but we pay them absolutely dreadfully, and we continue to the other thing about the kind of anywhere worldview, it's very, very public realm focused. It's about work and politics and public life. But actually, for most people, the most important things in life are in the private realm. It's it's your kind of private life and your family life and things like that. And I think we hugely underestimate the importance. That's one of the reasons why so many of the caring jobs are jobs that used to be done in the emotional economy of the family by women overwhelmingly for free. In our grandmother's generation, many of those jobs are now done outside the home, but partly for that reason, partly because they used to be done for free inside the family. They're held in relatively low esteem. But I think that's a more general function of holding the anywheres tend to hold the private realm. I mean, you see this in modern feminism, which is a very tends to be very dominated by kind of upper professional anywhere women. The kind of Nicky Morgans and Harriet Harmans tend to not have a very keen interest in the private realm. I mean, they see that as kind of belonging to women's past in some ways, and the important thing now is, is being able to compete equally with men in the public realm. But I think, if you kind of look at opinion data and things like that, that doesn't seem to be a view that is shared by most women in Britain. Obviously most women in Britain want to be able to compete equally with men in the public realm, but they want to place much greater influence than much of modern feminism does on the private realm of the family, and being able to stay at home when your children are very young for 2 or 3 years. Many women, and indeed some men, would like to do that, but it's become almost impossible for most families to be able to afford to do that. And we have no support in the tax system, or very, very minimal support in the tax system for families.
David, let me pause you there, because I can see that Francis, he's been wanting to jump in for about 20 minutes, but he's far too British to interrupt. That's the thing. So I'll be the foreigner here and go and create that opportunity.
I think you've touched on something, because I was a teacher for 10 years, and and I taught in primary, I taught in secondary, and I taught in deprived communities. Right. And I think you've really touched on something there about the anywheres. And I pretty much am an anywhere, but I think it's the arrogance of the anywhere. And I think it's their idea that they know best. And we saw that with Brexit, where all the anywheres went, what a surprise, everyone voted for Brexit. And it's like, no, you weren't listening. And I've seen it more and more and more, how in education, unless you subscribe to these sets of values, unless you are, good at essentially taking information, regurgitating it, you are thrown on the scrap heap, metaphorically. And one question I want to ask you is, at the moment it feels we're polarised. How do we bridge that gap? Can we do it? Or is this sense, because of technology and because of the way the education system is, that essentially the gap is going to grow wider and wider?
I think we can bridge the gap. I mean, with some difficulty. I mean, it's the purpose of politics is to bridge the gap in a way. I mean, that is what most, that is what good politicians should be focusing upon. I mean, it's what, politics is in a sense always at base about trying to bring conflicting views and indeed conflicting interests together to some degree, or finding compromises that allows different groups to function relatively happily together in the same society. I mean, I think obviously Brexit didn't create these divisions. These are divisions that have emerged particularly strongly over the last 20 or 30 years in response to both the cultural arrogance, but also the over-domination that we talked about earlier. And one manifestation of that over-domination, whether it's in the field of the economy, whether it's in the field of education, the massive over-expansion of higher education, whether it's in whether it's in the kind of almost the delegitimization of many small c conservative views and tradition, male breadwinner. I mean, lots of men, for the last couple of centuries have got out of bed in the morning essentially because they feel the responsibility of being a breadwinner. Now, for perfectly good reasons, in some cases that has gone or has become less important, because women have become much more autonomous, which is a good thing on the whole. I mean, my mother just kind of missed out on kind of mainstream modern feminism and suffered for that in many ways. And wasn't able to live the same sort of wasn't able to be as fulfilled as her daughters and granddaughters. But so in all these different areas, I mean, quite large minorities, if not majorities, of our society have not felt, this whole kind of left v right has been replaced by open v closed. It's an incredibly self-serving way of looking at the world. I mean, I've never met anyone who wants to live in a closed gulag-like society. Nobody does, obviously, but a lot of people feel that the forms of modern openness that we've created in the last 30 years, I mean, symbolised most graphically by the supply chain going to China, the rapid deindustrialisation of Britain, America even more so perhaps, or parts of Britain, and symbolised also by large-scale immigration. That the kind of double whammy, the feeling that your factory closes and goes to probably not China now, to Vietnam or Cambodia or somewhere, but then a whole new workforce is introduced into the country to compete with you in the service jobs that you're probably then doing, came as a real shock to people, I think. And most of those people, it's so important to emphasise this, against the contempt of much modern liberalism, most of those people are not hostile to the individual immigrant. They're anti-immigration, they're not anti-immigrant. I mean, it's an elision that liberals often make, such and such, the anti-immigrant party, the anti-immigrant politician. Well, there are some, but most of the time people are hostile to the immigration and not the immigrant. People who work in fish finger factories in Hull probably go out to drink after work with the Pole or Slovenian they're working beside. They're not hostile to the individual, but that doesn't mean to say they think it's in their economic or cultural interests to have had that movement of people on such a large scale. Clearly, it is very much part of the kind of, the liberal market system, and it's one part of it that has not, on the whole, benefited people, and so people have rightly pushed back against it.
So how can we resolve this, which is what France is getting at? Because our time is almost out. What are some of the potential ways of...
Well, I mean, I think a lot of the emphasis is on a lot of the responsibility for this. We've had anywhere liberal overreach in many aspects of our societies, and we need and anywheres need to be more emotionally intelligent about the extent of their domination. They need to, and you're seeing this already. You're sort of seeing the kind of anywhere classes, I think, dividing between the kind of admonished anywheres, the kind of Theresa Mays, who are sort of saying, it's true, we didn't really listen to people, and we bloody well should have done. Otherwise we wouldn't have ended up with Brexit. That this is our fault in many ways. And then you've got the kind of militant anywheres, the AC Graylings and Oliver Cams, who are sort of saying, they are the barbarians, we're the decent, civilized people. I think you are seeing that division. I mean, I think and hope, obviously, the kind of admonished liberals anywheres will win that argument. And once there is still quite a lot of common ground. I mean, one shouldn't. I mean, there's a lot of polarization. It's obviously magnified by social media and so on. Obviously, social media gives a megaphone to relatively small groups. So we sometimes have the impression, I think, that we're more polarized than we are. I'm not denying that we are polarised. We do have these value divides, and we need to find ways of finding common ground again, of finding some sort of settlement, post Brexit. And I think the kind of contours of it are reasonably clear, and it has to do with having greater respect for the more settled part of our population. After all, this has been. I mean, these people are not militants. This is a very, populism is a defensive. It's a defensive impulse. It is not, this is not the 1930s. They're not we're not thinking about kind of invading Denmark. It's about holding on to something that people wanted, which was a relatively stable life. And I think politics will have to take that into account more. And it already is. It's already doing so. I mean, with difficulty, it's true, but I mean, Brexit was essentially a somewhere policy that is now being implemented rather reluctantly by anywheres, both in the civil service and indeed in the 70% of the political class was Remainer.
But that sort of taps into the fear from the somewheres that all right, they made their point. They said this is what they want. They won. And now the fear is that the anywheres are not going to implement it, or if they do, they're not going to implement it properly, and they're going to fudge it. And my fear and Constantine's fear is that if that happens, that then allows the...
Depends how big the fudge is, I think. I mean, I think some degree of...
What Francis is talking about, I was on LBC a few days ago, And I said that I thought that, and we both voted Remain, by the way. We are
Yeah,
your
so did I.
quintessential.
Yeah.
We're your quintessential anyways.
Yeah.
in
Good
every way.
people.
Yeah.
But we
Every
are,
time I make that joke, the internet explodes, and someone's like, "You fucking big, you moaner prick." Anyway, sorry.
but we are very much, both of us now, coming around to the position of those anywheres who've woken up.
Yeah. Same here. I mean,
and
anyway.
we are
Yeah.
going, hold on a second. If Brexit isn't delivered, if Brexit is seriously fudged, this is what I said on LBC.
Oh, yeah.
I said
Or if we have a second vote, it could poison our politics for a generation. I agree. Absolutely.
Well, I actually said on the program, I thought that if Brexit it doesn't get delivered, you could have a political movement in this country led by someone like Tommy Robinson, with funding from someone like Steve Bannon. And you already see it happening. Steve Bannon's already talking about Tommy Robinson being a British patriot, and all this stuff is happening. And I got a lot of crap from both sides for saying that on the radio.
Oh, no, I mean,
And that's what-
UKIP will have 50 MPs even with first past the post, I think. I mean, if
Really?
if we really have a Brexit in name only. However, having said that, I mean, I think there is also a strong case for having a degree of fudge because it was only 52-48. It was 52-48. And so I think, you can't, we don't want a winner-takes-all Brexit either. We don't want a kind of a really hard Brexit. But I mean, there is a kind of reasonable, there is respecting Brexit sufficiently without, while taking into account the views of the 48 too. And I mean, that's a very kind of difficult combination. I mean, that is partly why our own internal argument has been so difficult, let alone the negotiation with Brussels. And people sort of say, "Oh, how awful it is!" But actually, this is democracy. It's a mess, but it's a democratic mess. It's an unavoidable democratic mess, given the 52-48 outcome. And I think and hope that we will get some kind of deal that'll be sufficient. It won't be perfect. There'll be grumbles on both sides, but we really do then have to get down to sorting out these internal differences, of which Brexit was a kind of manifestation. And I think, and Brexit, in a sense, will be the first step towards that sorting out. It does allow us to repatriate some of our democratic accountability, and it allows us to have a radical industrial policy if we want to. Now, there may be many arguments against having that, but we can do stuff now, or after Brexit, we'll be able to do stuff that we couldn't before. And I hope a lot of that energy goes into, the anywhere-dominated political class has had a huge shock from Brexit. And I think, and we are doing, we have a apprenticeship levy. Okay, people criticise the way it's been implemented. We have T levels. I mean, there is a recognition that we've kind of over-expanded higher education. The ridiculous idea that 50% of kids go to it's not so much. Obviously, we need forms of post-school education. All developed countries have, but we've gone for a very, very narrow classical university structure, 3 or 4 years, often sort of boarding, as I was saying, residential. And even if you're doing a degree in construction management, you still spend half the time writing essays. I mean, so they are very, very academic. And like other countries have a much greater range of post-school institutions, catering for a much greater range or a different range of functions and aptitudes and abilities. So, the community colleges in America or the Fachhochschule in Germany and things like that. We can, I think we'll kind of probably move in that direction more, thinking, worrying less about the pushing more and more kids to university. I think levels of immigration will come down. They're already coming down, partly because of the fall in sterling's made it less attractive economically for the kind of commuter immigrant to come here. What we really need, above all, I think, is, and what I hope will come from this, is actually liberals becoming less illiberal. Liberals actually becoming more pluralistic, accepting that there are other forms of life apart from their own sort of, Russell Group University liberalism, and their sort of, androgynous feminism, whatever. That other people live by different lights, and they're not monsters. That they have small c conservative views about a lot of things. But they're decent people still. They're decent populists. I use the phrase decent populists in my book. And what I mean by that is basically people who've accepted the great liberalisation. They accept the idea of human equality. They obviously don't think they have the same obligation to all humans in the world. You know, they believe in in their group, their country, and the interests of national citizen rights before universal rights. So they're not liberals, but they're part of the modern, in a very broad sense, kind of liberal acceptance of human equality. But they think that society has not reflected their interests, and they're often quite traditional, small c conservative interests. And I think the interesting thing is that politics. The American political scientist Daniel Bell, who talked about it sometime back in the 1980s, talked about his political credo. And he said I'm editing slightly, but he said he was a kind of market-friendly social democrat in economics. He was broadly liberal in politics, and he was somewhat conservative in social and cultural matters. Oh. And that combination seems to me the kind of hidden majority in our societies in some ways, and it's for all sorts of historical reasons the party political system has not reflected that combination. Although perhaps you might say the Tory manifesto, the last election, probably came closer to it than anything in recent politics. But it's sort of how we can kind of represent that hidden majority in our political system, I think, is one of the things that will kind of emerge over the next few years in the post-Brexit world.
Francis, you've barely got a word in edgeways this interview, so why don't you do the last question?
Okay, right. Okay, so we are running out of time. So, David, what we like to finish up with is there one issue that people aren't talking about that should be talking about, that we should all be talking about? Something maybe that we gloss over, and why?
Yeah, I mean, I do think the Theresa May talked about her burning injustices, and I think in many cases she focused on very much the kind of Whitehall sort of liberal establishment burning injustices. I mean, the gender pay gap. But the gender pay gap is overwhelmingly the result of the preferences expressed, the different preferences expressed by men and women. The fact that women, when they have young children, overwhelmingly choose to work part-time, etc., etc. I think there are serious injustices in some of the ways that are. One of the biggest injustices, and it's very hard to know quite what to do about it. Although in a clumsy way, the Tory manifesto I just referred to sort of had a kind of failed bash at it. The I think this is actually an economic thing in a way, rather than we've been talking mainly about cultural things. But the fact the enormous unearned increase in wealth, arbitrary unearned increase in wealth for people who happen to live, in London, parts of the southeast, and little pockets of the rest of the country, as a result of the increasing value of their houses, is going to create down the road a real problem unless we find some fair way of kind of tapping into it. I mean, we've got 10 million people in this country are now wealthy. I mean, obviously a small slice of them are the kind of traditionally wealthy, but 10 million people who happen to own properties in the right part of the country are unaccountably and unexpectedly rich. So, I mean, the whole issue of inheritance is going to become really thorny one, I think, because it's a natural human impulse. You want to kind of hand on what you have to your children. How we tap into that wealth, without. I mean, if I'm allowed a second one, I would say that which almost sort of conflicts with that first one, is the way in which modern family policy, I think, influenced very much by a kind of anywhere professional feminism, has really not placed enough effort on supporting young couples bringing up young children. in much of continental Europe, you essentially, if you're a young couple bringing up children, you essentially pay no tax or very little tax. Whereas here we do not allow couples, and I don't think you should have to be married. I think the genie is out of the bottle on that. I think anyone who can prove they've been cohabiting for a couple of years and they have a kid together should be able to share their tax allowances. I mean, that would make a huge difference. We have what are it's £12,500 you can combine two people's tax allowances and you're already pretty much at the average wage. And we spend £9 billion on childcare, subsidising childcare. You can't get a penny of that to look after your own child. We do. It's this anywhere public realm focus, and much of contemporary feminism has adopted that similarly sort of public realm focus as a measure of equality. But there are millions of families who would, and most of us, most human beings in Britain, most of the things that really matter to them are in the private realm, and we're not doing nearly. And we have a huge amount of family breakdown. We're not quite as bad as America, but we're worse than much of continental Europe. Only less than half of 15-year-olds, I think, still live with their two biological parents. This is not a good state of affairs, and we've been too blasé about it. And I think it's a combination of a certain sort of liberal individualist sort of squeamishness, combined with a certain strand of modern feminism, has prevented us providing more support for young families when they really need it. Now, I mean, it's not only people break up for all sorts of reasons. It's not just money, but money will often be behind conflict in a family, and we need to do much more to help people stay together and bring up kids in a secure environment.
I think this interview probably wins the award for the fewest questions that we've ever asked.
Sorry, I talk too much.
No, it's great.
Down to how articulate and eloquent you are on these issues. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for coming to talk to us. You're very active on Twitter, I notice, in battles pretty much every day with different people. So if anyone wants to follow you on Twitter and be a kind of a peaceful observer to these battles, you are on Twitter at...
I am. Oh gosh, what am I? I'm David_Goodhart. Is that
what we'll do is we'll double check it, and if it's not that, we'll stick it in the video.
I'm definitely David. Is there something else? No. What that sounds like I'm at David _Goodhart, aren't I? Yeah.
Brilliant. Also, is the book that you so fascinatingly talked about?
It's called The Road to Somewhere.
Yeah, The Road to Somewhere. Yeah.
And we'll put a link to that as well.
Yeah.
And you work at the Policy Exchange.
I work at Policy Exchange think tank, and I'm doing another book in the next year or so, basically on this theme of how smart people are too politically powerful.
Well, come back and talk to us about that then when it's ready to go.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And just to say, thank you very much, guys. If you've watched it, we hope you enjoy the show. If you could click subscribe, if you hit the bell button, which is on the right of the screen, that will keep you updated when we get all the videos. If you were listening to this on iTunes, please click subscribe. Leave us a review. Say something nice.
5 stars.
Five
stars.
Yeah, or horrible. No, please
I
say
spoke too much.
Yeah, but please say something nice. And if you're enjoying it and you really like it, tell a friend. Tell a friend about it. And like I said before, if you don't like someone, recommend it. And and if you're not enjoying it, recommend it to someone you don't like. All right, okay. But it's been great. Thanks very much, and we'll see you see you next week. Bye-bye.